And before I introduce our guest for tonight, I want to say a little bit about how we're going to proceed. Mr. Wright will speak for about 30 minutes, and then he'll take some questions from us. If you're in the library, you can write your questions on the slips of paper that we have available. And if you're part of the Zoom audience, you can submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Lawrence Wright is a long-term resident of Austin. He grew up in Abilene and Dallas, and he worked for the Texas Monthly before joining the New Yorker in 1992. He's written 11 nonfiction books, including The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda, and The Road to 9/11, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and God Save Texas, which is being developed as a 3-part documentary for HBO. His most recent nonfiction book is The Plague Year, and that is based on an article that he wrote for The New Yorker on our current pandemic. He's also written 2 novels, including the New York Times bestseller, The End of October, which is the focus of tonight's discussion. So I'll turn it over to Lawrence Wright.
Oh, thank you, Lee. And it's good to virtually be back in Alpine. My wife and I spent some nice time in Alpine. We went over to Coconut Park and watched a performance of Into the Woods. It was just a beautiful evening, and I really want to get back and see a ball game in that stadium. Looked like one of the nicest baseball stadiums I've ever seen. So I'll tell you a little bit about how this novel came about. You know, years ago, Ridley Scott, the filmmaker, approached me, and Ridley, he's turning 84. He's just got a new movie coming out next month. So he's a real role model for me. But he had already done Gladiator and Thelma and Louise and Blade Runner, and but he approached me because he had read Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Road. And if you've read that, and it's a wonderful book, but it's about a father and son who are wandering through the ruins of civilization. And so Ridley's question to me was, well, what happened? Because Cormac didn't bother to explain how civilization dissolved. It just had. And I thought that was an interesting idea. And so I wrote a script for Ridley. And while I was working on it, I thought, well, what could bring civilization to an end? And, the first thought, of course, is a nuclear war. But, it's really hard to find a hero with a nuclear war. And then I thought back to my early days as a reporter when we were living in Atlanta. And I had done several stories that took me for the Centers for Disease Control. And I was dazzled. I had never been in a government agency that impressed me so much. The people that worked there, they were brilliant, but they were also humble, and they were courageous. They would go off to these hot zones that I wouldn't want to get near. It's just, and they regarded the institution they worked for as a kind of holy place. It really affected me. So I thought, well, there are heroes galore in public health. And I decided that my hero would, Henry Parsons, would be an epidemiologist who worked at CDC. So that's how I came to figure out what the story was going to be about. Now, writing a novel, I wrote one previous novel. It was called God's Favorite, and it was a different experience for me because almost all of my other writing had been nonfiction, but I had written plays and I had written a movie called The Siege with Denzel Washington, and so I had my toe in the fiction waters, but not very deep. And but it started off very much like The End of October. It was going to be a movie for Oliver Stone, and so I wrote the script, and he actually cast Al Pacino. I don't know what happened to the movie, but one day I got a call from him and it had fallen through. And so I set the novel aside, and then a few years later, I decided I would write it as a novel. And as I was working on it, another director asked if he could make it into a movie, and I said, "Well, no, I'm trying to write a novel now." And anyway, we bargained, and the idea was the novel would come out before the movie because it just seemed awkward the other way around. So Bob Hoskins starred as Noriega, and who is the hero in this. And but I finished the novel on the set of the movie, and it was kind of convenient because, for instance, I had a scene with a witch doctor, and in a screenplay, you just say witch doctor's studio. Noriega enters, so you don't have to do very much in the way of describing. But on the movie set, they had to dress it all up. So as a novelist, I would go into the set of the witch doctor's studio and take notes of what the set director had put inside there, and then I wrote it in the novel. It's a kind of not very cost efficient way to write a novel, but that was my only previous experience in writing a novel. And it's different from writing a movie or a play, because in a movie or a play, there's no narrative. There's only characters and scenes. And so with a novel, you have to paint the picture. You have to be able to visualize the scene that you're writing and describe it. And but you also have to get inside the mind of your character. And that's something that that for the most part, screenwriters and playwrights don't have to do. It's all action and dialogue. There's no penetration of the mental process. And that's the challenge that novelists face. And I've learned a lot about the craft of writing novels since I've written the end of October. And I found that there are three things that you draw upon when you are writing fiction, but especially writing a novel. And one is your life. This novel is full of anecdotes and inside stories about my life that you wouldn't know or were taken from my life. But it's when you're dealing with things you actually experienced, it's a lot easier to write those things. For instance, Henry lived in Atlanta. Well, as it happens, I have him on my same street in the house that we lived in. I have him remodeling the house in the way that we did. It was a lot easier to do that and to imagine it. And it was also kind of fun to re-experience what had been a very meaningful time in our lives and reinvent it in the form of fiction. But I could see the house. I could see, and we had a tenant upstairs. She wasn't as lunatic as a tenant in the novel, but she did have a lot of cats. So I found there was some fertile ground for me to draw upon by using that experience. And also, Henry is a family man, and I am too. And I found that the intensity of his relationship with his children, who are quite different from mine, but that was something that I really drew upon. And I liked Henry's relationship with his children. I think that it's a strength in a novel if you find people who really love each other. It draws the reader in, and that was something that I intended. There are scenes that echo real life. For instance, there's a chapter I call Idaho, where the family goes on a prolonged uh, camping trip in the wilds of Idaho, and we did too. We didn't get attacked by bears, but we had back in those days, I couldn't afford to take my family on vacation, so I would write articles for travel magazines, and then we could. And this was such an article, and we went into the wilds of a nature preserve, and it was great, a great bonding experience. And it's the bond that I wanted to capture in reliving that experience in fiction. And, another thing, another part of my life that turned out to be very important in the novel was Saudi Arabia. I had lived in Saudi Arabia after 9/11 when I was working on the looming tower, and the Saudis wouldn't let me in as a reporter, and I had to take a job. I became an expat worker, which is a category they approve of. And my job was mentoring young reporters in Jeddah, which was bin Laden's hometown. And one of my first jobs in mentoring these young reporters was overseeing their coverage of the Hajj in Mecca. Now, I couldn't go to Mecca because I'm not a Muslim, but every day I was on the phone with my reporters. And what happens one thing that happens in the Hajj, you have 2 to 3 million people all gathered together from all parts of the earth, pressed together very closely. And they bring sicknesses from different parts of the globe. And all of my reporters got sick. And they brought it back to the office. But every year there's an outbreak of at least one serious disease, diphtheria, for instance. There are things that are really dangerous. And I thought, wow, this is actually a danger to the whole world, because come the end of Hajj, all of these people get on the plane and they fly to all parts of the earth. And suppose they're all sick, or a portion of them, they carry these diseases to the ends of the earth, and you have an instantaneous pandemic. And that was in my mind. I don't mean to say that the Hajj is not even the largest religious gathering on earth, but those kinds of mass gatherings pose a terrible challenge to health officials. And so that was, and knowing people in Saudi Arabia, I felt much more comfortable writing about them. So those are experiences that I drew from my life, and that's one source of inspiration. But another one is simply research. And that's something that I've done my entire life as a writer. If I were writing, I did write a nonfiction book about a pandemic, but just as I would have if I'd been writing a book about a pandemic, a nonfiction book, when I was working on The End of October, I researched it. And I went out in the world. Back then, there was no pandemic at the time. And I went around the country. I spoke to a lot of people in public health. For instance, I went to the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Fauci's shop in the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda. And I was trying to find a scientist who could help me invent a virus that would be very plausible, that could actually happen, and that's something that somebody like that scientist would believe. And I came upon Barney Graham. Barney is a farm boy from Kansas. He's 6'5", got a lanky with a drawl. He's a great character. But he helped me design an influenza virus that would be really deadly, but also could really happen. as it turns out, Barney Graham would become the guy who invented the vaccine that we are now taking to stop the coronavirus. He and his postdoc, Jason McClellan, in 2 days invented the vaccine that is in Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson and all the vaccines. I had no idea that I was dealing with the most prominent immunologist in the whole world, but that's what research does for you. It made my virus plausible to people who would otherwise criticize it. It's also, I went to a submarine base in Kings Bay, Georgia, because there's a big portion of the novel that's set on a submarine, and I knew nothing about submarines. I can't tell you how much fun it is to be able to go out in the world and say, I'd like to get on one of your nuclear submarines. And they say, well, okay, you're a writer, and so you have an excuse. It's like a passport to go anywhere, talk to anybody. And there's a lot of joy in that. But I got to go on this nuclear submarine, and they're really big. They each carry, they can carry 24 multi-MIRV missiles that are 4 stories tall. So they're vertical. Imagine that the submarine is actually 4 stories tall to accommodate these massive missiles. And each of them has 10 warheads on them. Each of those warheads far more powerful than the Hiroshima. So one of these submarines could destroy much of the Earth. And the missiles themselves are all painted lipstick red. And between each missile silo, there are bunks. So that's where everybody's dormitories are, and I could never have written all the stuff about submarines had it not been for the generosity of the Navy in allowing me to talk to the people that operated the sub. There was even a moment when they took me in when they were doing a training exercise, and these were the guys who actually target the missiles, and these guys you hope are really sane, but the evidence was that they weren't, because one of them, I said, "Where's the trigger?" And he pulled out what looked like a pistol grip with a coil of wire going, somewhere. And he said, "This is it. You want to pull the trigger?" Anyway, the world is still existing, so we got away with that one. But my research led me back to Barney, because I had my hero on the submarine, and he had to cure the virus that Barney invented. And so I had no idea how to go about it. And so he helped me design the cure. Now, it's not a whole lot of difference from nonfiction writing, because in nonfiction writing, you usually ask what happened. In the case of writing this novel, the question was, what could happen? It's similar, but it's subtly and importantly different. Now, the last thing that you draw upon as a novelist, at least in my experience, is pure imagination. And I don't know any writer who understands where that comes from. It's a mystery. If there's anything that can make me believe in a divine being, it's that sense of surprise that something just comes to you, and you're you don't have any responsibility for it. Some idea emerges, and the language appears. It's about as thrilling an experience as you can have when suddenly some wonderful thing pops into your mind and you didn't earn it. It's just a gift that floated out of nowhere. And so that's the difference between writing and approaching genius, because what else is genius but the gift of some eternal insight like that? So when I was writing the screenplay for Ridley, I had to think about movie stars, Tom Hanks, Denzel Washington, Matt Damon, and but a novel doesn't need a movie star. What it needs is someone who has a very interesting mind, someone who has an experience that occupies his thoughts, and in an interior life, because you don't see an interior life on the screen. You just see the action and hear the words. In a novel, you have to, just like a submarine, you have to go inside the mind of your character and discover what makes him tick. So Henry Parsons came from different sources. First of all, there really was a real life Henry Parsons. In the 1890s, there was an influenza epidemic in England, and Henry was a country doctor, and he had been pressed into service as an assistant epidemiologist in London. And it was Henry Parsons who proved beyond a doubt that influenza, the word means influences, actually passed through contagion and infection, not through the air, which is what, it was thought to be environmental gases carried these flu germs. It wasn't a concept then, but into people's bodies. And it was Henry Parsons who proved that actually people infect each other. And this was a breakthrough in epidemiology, but his name is scarcely remembered even by epidemiologists. So I decided I would resurrect him and give him a name. I wanted him to be touched by disease himself. And the disease I chose for him was rickets. It's a disease you don't hear very much about now, but I had a friend who was a professor of religion at SMU, and he suffered from rickets. And it struck me that he did so with such dignity. He's somewhat malformed, eruptions on his skin and so on, a little hunched. But there's something about his woundedness that gave him a presence that elevated him. I admired him a lot. And so I borrowed his disease. And then I wanted him also, religion has been a big theme in my work. I've written about so many different religions. I've written about Catholicism, and I even wrote about Satanism. I wrote about radical Islam, Mormons, and Scientology. And I had also written about the Jim Jones cult. And I had been very affected by the people that I talked to who had survived that. So I decided I would use that. And that Henry had been a child in that, and he had been scarred by that experience. So those are just examples of how you can draw from your own life, from research, and then finally from imagination, to try to breathe life into what is really just an exercise in conjuring, to try to bring people and scenes to life. After Ridley decided not to make the movie and went on to make several bad movies instead, I had set the screenplay aside with some other discarded projects. But in 2014, my wife and I went on a trek in England. We chose to go on the Pilgrim's Way, which is a path from Westchester to Canterbury, which is what Chaucer's Pilgrims, the path they took. Then we went from there on to Dover. And it was a wonderful trip. We just had a great time. But along the way, we passed through these little villages, and there were always churchyards. And essentially, religion is dead in England. So these churches were empty. they were actually maintained by a historical society. And we would also often take our lunches and picnic in the cemetery. And, you know, it was very picturesque and maybe not spooky particularly, but it was, you know, quite English countryside. And I began to pay attention to the tombstones. And one thing that struck me was the date 1918. Now, of course, England suffered terribly in the World War I, but the war was joined by the Spanish flu, the 1918 flu, which actually killed more soldiers than the war did. It killed between 50 and 100 million people. We don't know how many exactly. In America, it kills, we think, 675,000 people, which is about what we're at right now with COVID-19. Of course, we're 3 times larger country, but the 1918 flu lowered the average lifespan of Americans by 7 years. It was an incredibly devastating experience, but largely forgotten. So I studied the 1918 flu when we got back, and I actually made out a calendar on my computer. I picked the year 2020. I don't, you know why, but then I imposed on my calendar the events that happened in 1918, and then I used that to structure the progress of the disease, my Congolese influenza, in my novel. So it really is an echo of a real life event. The book actually came out in April 2020 at the peak of the first wave. And I don't advise bringing out a book when all the bookstores are closed. But I was accused of manipulating or taking advantage of the pandemic, when totally a coincidence, and a kind of unfortunate one. The book had been meant as a kind of cautionary tale, that this is something that could happen if we're not careful. And by the time it came out, it was happening. I remember this BBC presenter interviewing me about it, and he said, "I suppose no one would pay any attention to this book at all if it weren't for this pandemic." So, well, I really felt accused, but that was it was eerie, I have to say, that the book came out right in the middle of a pandemic, and is about a pandemic, and my pandemic is worse, but there are things that could have happened that there were a lot of things I foresaw only because I had done the research, and I talked to people in public health, and I asked them what would happen if this recurred. And so they told me, and I read the tabletop exercises that the governments had done. I looked through history, and it wasn't an act of prophecy to try to imagine what would happen if we had a pandemic in our own time. But it began, to a lot of readers, it seemed like it. But they hadn't done the research, and they hadn't talked to the people I talked to. But when the real pandemic came out, it was interesting to see what things I got wrong. One thing I got wrong was the willingness of people to actually sequester themselves for months at a time, at a great personal loss, financial, emotional, social, spiritual, and just in so many ways. Our society has been touched and harmed by this disease. And I didn't give a lot of people as much credit as they merit. Although you can see how that resilience began to wane. And now we find ourselves in a difficult spot once again. One of the big differences between my novel and real life is that in the novel, the disease is worse. The fatality rate is probably not as contagious as the Delta variant, but is far more fatal. It something like another coronavirus called MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. It kills about 40% of the people it infects. Fortunately, COVID-19 is not nearly as deadly as its cousin, but it resembled the virus that I had invented as a possible pandemic. But in real life, our financial institutions still functioned, and the food supply was never interrupted. Those were critical differences, which in my novel, they failed. The big difference is, however, that we have a vaccine. In the novel, they still were undefended against this terrible pandemic. However, there's still a cautionary tale to be told about what will happen in the future. I hope that we never have a virus as deadly and contagious as the one that I depict, but it's likely we will. If you look just since the turn of the century, we've had Ebola, we've had bird flu, we've had SARS, we've had Nipah, we've had West Nile, we've had Zika, and now we've got COVID-19. This is in the space of 20 years. One after another, these new viruses are appearing at a faster clip, some of them more dangerous than others. Nipah is wildly fatal. Fortunately, it hasn't become so contagious, but there are other viruses out there, and they're constantly mutating. So I think in that sense, the book is still a caution. And anyway, that's my remarks. I hope I'll hear some questions from some of you.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Well, I do have some questions already.
All right.
And you've actually answered quite a few of them. Several people wanted to know, these are questions that we got ahead of time from book clubs and the like. And they wanted to know, where you got your idea, and which came first, the idea for the fiction or the research, and you sort of answered those a little bit. One other question that you also answered was about the Spanish flu, how you use that as a kind of a model.
Yeah.
For this one.
Well, Lee, I want to say something about that I didn't get a chance to talk about.
Okay.
One of the most mysterious things about Spanish flu is it was totally forgotten. And, of course, the war overshadowed it. Although, as I said, the flu was far more mortal. But looking back in history, that was characteristic of other pandemics. And of course, until pretty recent times, people were far more used to seeing death from infectious diseases. And so in 1918, they wouldn't have been surprised. I mean, there were very few vaccines. They had the concept of a virus, but they had no idea how to describe it. So, but I was talking to after this novel, I wrote a nonfiction book, The Plague Year, and I was interviewing a historian of epidemiology, Gianna Pomata in Bologna, Italy. And I asked her what this disease, this particular pandemic that we were experiencing reminded her of in history. And she said the Black Plague in 14th century Italy. Now, not in terms of the scale of death, it killed a third of Europe, but in terms of changing society. And her point was that in the Middle Ages, this plague came along and it caused people to realize something's not working here. And part of it was the piety, the rule of the Catholic Church, the absence of science, all of these things. And then also, the feudalism, all of those things were called into question. And a fresh breeze of thought came into people's minds. And that eventually led to the Renaissance. So it's too early to tell how our society has changed, but it has changed and we've changed. But that's something that I did for my nonfiction book, but it'd be interesting to revisit it in fiction.
I'm just curious, have you reread your novel, or do you intend to, or?
I've thought about doing a sequel,
Okay.
and it ends at an interesting point where it could be, and so that's something I'm struggling with now, is which project I'll do next.
Interesting. Well, when I read the novel, I was drawn to the gaps. For example, were you in the one chapter with Mr. Bang Bang gone to Hajj? And so we know we didn't see him go. We don't know what happens until a little bit later. But there are a number of gaps where you, or where you announced that Helen didn't bury Jill for a week at the beginning of a chapter, and so we haven't seen it happen. Well, we have a question from somebody in the Zoom audience. He wants to know why you decided not to include a reunion scene of him.
Oh, I've been asked this a number of times, and
Ah,
on balance, I probably should have, but it didn't fit. And the gaps that you're talking about, that comes from screenwriting. It's I'm trained more in that. And in a movie, you just cut to something, and then the audience catches up. And and I still kind of like that. I feel like you don't have to write everything. But there are a lot of people that have complained to me about not having the reunion scene. But I figured that once they made telephone contact, then you could fill in the blanks.
yeah. Well, I personally thought that was effective, so
Oh, thank you.
I didn't mind it at all.
It was an artistic decision, but it was, it's one subject to question by a lot of my readers.
Well, here's another question. Why is it called The End of October?
Well, that's interesting. When I was working on it as a screenplay for Ridley, it was spring, summer, fall, because of 3 seasons that we deal with. And I liked that title, but then I began to, consider that there was something about the fall that, was the crucial point. And, actually here we are again, approaching a crisis, and the pandemic tends to exhibit all its colors, when it comes to a climax in the fall. And the end of October is probably the most dangerous time. And then I discovered October Revolution Island, and all of these things began to subtly whisper in my ear. And I like the kind of mystique that the title has. So that's how that came about.
Another question. Did you, in your writing process, did you kind of make or decide on specific characters, and kind of give them a character ahead of time, or did you just let them develop as they release them into your fiction and let them do whatever they were going to do?
Well, you start off with an idea for a character, and you award that person some qualities. Like I wanted Henry to have been injured by disease, and I wanted him. Originally, when I was working on it as a movie, a lot of times in movies, your hero seems so unattached, because you don't have time. It's all about the action and so on. So having family and wife and all this sort of stuff seems like a burden. I wanted this person to be deeply rooted in relationships. And so those are the thoughts that I had. But then what happens, which is exciting, but also kind of volatile, is that your characters will grab the reins. And sometimes there's a little bit of a tug of war, when a character kind of wants to go off on its own journey, and it might be the wrong character. The journey is going in the wrong direction, and you have to amputate that decision and, you know, funnel back into your main. But on the other hand, sometimes you follow that, and the discursiveness is part of the joy of reading a novel that is really rich. It can have a lot of texture to it, but usually that's because the characters have exerted themselves. There's a wonderful book by E.M. Forster called Aspects of the Novel, and in there he talks about round characters and flat characters. And flat characters are ones that are, you know them like that instantly, but there's no depth to them. You identify them by a relationship or by a quirk, a habit of speech, or, their job title, but you don't have to know very much about them. But it's good to slap some kind of identifying qualities on them. But a round character is one who you can imagine what they had for breakfast, even if the author hasn't told you. You get to be so familiar with that character, and it's a balance. You can't have all round characters, and you can't have all flat characters. You need to pick which ones are going to be round and how round they'll be.
Did Jill try to get away from you, or did you know ahead of time you were going to kill her off?
I don't think Jill wanted to die, but a sacrifice was required, and so one of the things I learned about when I wrote the movie The Siege, and Annette Bening played a CIA agent, and she was kind of an untrustworthy character, who played both sides of the aisle, but she gets killed in the end. And one thing I learned is that when the character dies, everybody forgives them. They love the person who died. And so I decided that Jill would be a more memorable character in people's hearts if she died.
Interesting. I have a message from Nan, and she wants me to ask the YouTube viewers if they would also like to submit questions. So that's just a little commercial.
All right.
For a second. Okay. Let me see. Let me go back to these here. This is kind of a full question, maybe. In the novel, the interaction between the various national and international organizations seemed pretty flawed at various points, and also there have been issues with the way our government has handled the current pandemic. And did you have an idea from the research you'd done that there would be that kind of problem in the way that the pandemic was dealt with by the authorities?
Well,
did that come from the imagination?
One thing I learned in studying pandemics is that there's a lot of blame attached to them. And, the Spanish flu, Spain had nothing to do with the Spanish flu. It's like a donkey tag, you don't want to get tagged with it. And so we're blaming China for the pandemic, and China's blaming us, and Russia's blaming both of us. And and there is blame to be passed around, to be frank, but it causes a lot of geopolitical tension. And in the novel, I was torn between focusing on our relationship with China or with Russia. And I chose Russia, but in retrospect, I might as well have taken China instead. There are geopolitical consequences that are still to be borne out with this pandemic and the one that we are actually facing. and China's role in it. If it was created in a lab, which I think is just as plausible as if it might have come from nature, from a bat, then, there are lab leaks all the time. There are lab CDC, Fort Detrick, smallpox leaked out of labs in England on 3 occasions, killing nearly 100 people. And 4 times SARS leaked out of labs in China. So this happens. It's possible. And if it did, it was a mistake. But if it was covered up, it's a crime. And so, if you look at things the way I do geopolitically, there are reverberations, and they're terribly, terribly dangerous. In the novel, they get carried too far. But bear in mind, those things can happen. And, I was fascinated in my research to find how much both the United States and Soviet Union at the time, how much biochemical warfare they had invested in. And even to the point that the Soviets were loading up missiles with smallpox virus. And I don't know that that's ever been destroyed. And other very, very deadly viruses. And we experimented on it as well at Fort Detrick. So, and that's where, Henry had some experience working. So I wanted to invest the novel with that extra dimension of the geopolitics.
So Fort Detrick is a real place.
Fort Detrick is a real place. It's an old farm. I visited it. And actually, one of my inspirations for Henry was a scientist working there, and he's also kind of he's also a kind of model for my villain, because they experiment on animals there, and that's a very tortured political and moral argument about what we do to animals in order to create vaccines and test for new viruses and so on. And I had liked having Henry be involved in such a complicated moral dilemma. But this scientist that I'm speaking of, his office is perfectly spare. There are no books on his bookshelves. There's nothing on his desk but his laptop. And on the wall, there is only a picture of a snapping shrimp who plays a big role in the novel. I'd never heard of a snapping shrimp before. And, but this scientist really admired their qualities. And, but he wore canvas shoes and canvas belt, and he's a vegetarian. And he said, if I have to experiment on animals, I don't have to eat them. And I thought, that's a bargain that he has made. And I admire him for struggling with it. And that's, so he was one of the inspirations I had for Henry, working at Fort Detrick. It's the old farmhouse still stands out there, but there are some buildings that are so super secret that even the guy I was talking to can't go into them.
One of the viewer wants to know if you'll talk a little bit more about the bad guy, about Jürgen.
Well, Jürgen, I've always been interested in animal rights. And in fact, I'm actually working on a story right now for the New Yorker about that. And Jürgen came to me in part because of that scientist I was describing, but also because there are groups that the FBI considers as dangerous in some respects as white supremacists and Al-Qaeda and so on. They haven't turned out to be quite as dangerous so far, but some of them have agendas. And so do some of the white supremacists. Like there's a group that calls itself the Base, which is what Al-Qaeda means in Arabic. And they model themselves on, and they want to destroy much of humanity, and not to save the animals, but to reduce the population to white people. And that intrigues me. And there was a group called Om Shinrikyo, do you remember the Japanese cult, the yoga, it had the blind yoga instructor, and uh, that was, I think, even more, possibly far more dangerous than Al Qaeda, because there were a lot of engineers, very smart scientists, and they were intent on diminishing the population of the world. And so there would be a remnant. And, this dream is alive in various groups. And I thought I would give that, I think of Jürgen as being a kind of noble character who is deeply morally flawed. And but his stance, which is that all animals have equal claim to life, is one that a lot of people adhere to. But he is willing to take it to another step to reduce the harm to the animal world by eliminating much of the human population.
Did you, by any chance, read the review? The reviewer said that she spent a long time Googling him, trying to find out if he was a real person.
Yeah, I know. One of my reviewers Googled somebody else that she said wasn't a real person, and he was. And I kind of got offended that she didn't do a good enough Google.
Another question, a kind of a geopolitical question, I guess, is about, in the novel, you talk about viral sovereignty.
Sovereignty, yeah.
Yeah, where countries can actually have patents for diseases, and one of the things that Henry does is try to arrange for countries to share in the benefit from in the way you put it, is the scientific exploitation of a disease. Did you invent that, or?
No, not at all.
Wow,
No,
so
it's a real thing. And Indonesia was the country where I put it. That is actually where that arose. And the argument made by lesser developed countries where these diseases often originate is that so Western countries go off and make vaccines, and then they inoculate their populations, but not ours. And and it's the concept is a little perverse, but the concept is it's our disease after all. It's not that we invented it, but it's like a natural resource, like gold or something like that came out of our country, and we should have a claim on it. Well, I am very opposed to this idea, but on the other hand, there was enough of a rationale and then enough of a political reason to reach an accommodation along the lines of the one that I have Henry structure.
So that they get the benefit of the vaccine.
At least they don't subvert the process, which, if you look at what's happening with China now and their reluctance to be transparent, that's the kind of thing you're trying to stop. And, that it's very, very dangerous to world health when countries hide budding pandemics inside their countries.
Okay. Let me see what I have here. Okay, well, I'm going to switch gears slightly then to talk about a little bit about the project that you're part of, where what we're going to be doing here is in another month is talking about our healthcare system out here, which is very limited, especially now, especially during COVID. And I wanted to know if, while you were doing research for the novel, or while you were doing research for the plague year, either one, if you discovered inequities in healthcare delivery that affected the way individuals experience the pandemic. If you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's I see this pandemic as being like an X-ray into our society, and you can see all the broken places, and it's useful because we really now know what kind of country we are. But the disparities ethnically, and then the breakdown with urban and rural, is very stark, and so if this, trying to, first of all, you need more people in public health. But what has happened is the tens of thousands of jobs have been lost. And so instead of having more people to spread out and take care of these disparities, we have many fewer. And even among the people that remain, this has been a scarring, traumatic experience for many frontline workers and public health workers, some of whom have been hounded out of office. And it's totally shocking and disgraceful that we would turn on the people we need the most during this period of time. So we're starting with a deficit to try to cover up these disparities. And I am not confident that we're going to be able to repair that anytime soon. Right now, 1 out of 500 Americans is dead of COVID. It's just unbelievably shocking, the scale of this disaster. And it's far more dire in the Black community. I think it's something, it's in the 300s. It's just amazing to believe that, that something like that could sweep through our country, reap such a horrible harvest of people, and that it continues. And that our governments have done such a poor job of trying to stem the tide. Instead of stemming the tide, they've opened the floodgates in some respects. So we need governance, and we need healthcare workers, and we need to be more attentive to attend to the communities that are most in need. And that includes rural communities like yours.
Okay, you should come back and talk with us in October on this issue. There's another question specifically about the novel. Is Tildy and her Russia obsession based on someone real?
No, but it's based on, I've talked to a lot of people in her kind of job, in my Washington reporting days. And so I could envision Tildy. I'm always impressed by the kind of people who rise to those levels inside government. One thing they have going for them is this ironclad certainty. They're so sure of themselves, and whether they're right or wrong, they are absolutely certain. And that's one of the qualities that Tildy has. But I give her enough background. I borrowed some of her experience from Condi Rice, but there are other people that Dick Clark, who was counterterrorism czar, that I got to know very well. He's more often right than wrong, but that we got to do this. We got to this brave new world quality that's there. So many people in those kinds of positions have, that oftentimes lead us into catastrophe.
Somebody wanted to know about whether or not you were going to do a sequel, and you already actually addressed that issue.
If that's a vote for it, I'll account it in the tally.
Yeah. Well, before we started, somebody gave me a question, and he's actually here. So if I don't paraphrase it correctly, he needs to let me know. This is about the plague year, the chapter on masks. where you talk a little bit about the places where people use masks, wore masks, were in much better economic situations. They didn't have as many problems with, having a higher rates of outbreaks. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the economic differences between the areas who masked up and the areas who didn't?
Yeah, Matt Pottinger was one of my sources, and he was a deputy national security advisor in the Trump White House. And he spoke fluent Mandarin, and he had been a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in China during the SARS outbreak in 2002 and 3. I have to say the American intelligence community totally missed the consequences of this pandemic. But Matt, having been a reporter, picked up the phone and began calling sources in China. And this is not something that people in the public health community were doing, certainly not the intelligence community, but one guy in the White House calls sources and says, how are you handling this? And the answer was, well, washing your hands and socially distancing, those are important. But if you really want to put the brakes on this, you got to mask up. That's the only thing that'll do it. And he pointed to Hong Kong, the densest city in the world, which got, very moderate outbreak. And it wasn't like mainland China where they locked up everybody. It's a democracy, and but they handled themselves because they had been trained by previous epidemics to use masks. The same thing was true in South Korea. South Korea, which has about, I think, 30 million people, has fewer deaths than South Dakota, which only has 900,000 people in it. The difference is the real difference, Lee, in nations that have done well and those that have done poorly is trust. The nations that did well had trust in their government, trust in science, trust in the authority. And those that did poorly, like ours, were wreaked, and divided, and highly distrustful of authority. There was the Trump administration did a tabletop exercise called Crimson Contagion. And it's kind of spooky to read it now, but the idea was a traveler comes back from China and to Chicago, and he's got a dry cough. The next day, his son goes to a rock concert. 6 months later, 567,000 Americans are dead. Pretty close to exactly where we are, right? And what did the Trump administration learn? That supply lines would be discontinued, that there would be confusion in government about who was in charge, which agencies were doing what, states wouldn't know what to do, businesses would have to cope with people staying at home to work. Everything that was envisioned happened, and yet not a single lesson was drawn from it. All the mistakes that the Trump administration knew it would make, they did make. And masking is just one of those horrible, it was our last chance, really. But when the president announced at Matt Pottinger's urging that masks were important, the first thing he said was, it's voluntary and I'm not going to do it. And he even went to a mask making factory without a mask. So, it was a tragedy because we didn't have any other bullets in our gun. That was it. Masks were the last thing that we had before the vaccines to try to put brakes on the contagion.
Here's another question. What keeps you up awake at night in relation to the pandemic?
Years ago, not that many years ago, but I wrote a profile of the director of national intelligence. And and I got to go visit a lot of people in the intelligence community. There are 16 intelligence agencies in America. And at one point, I got to visit the guy, you know, in the James Bond movie, the guy that invents the weapons. I think he's called Q, which has a different kind of meaning these days. But anyway, he wouldn't show me the good stuff. But I asked him kind of the question that our friend just asked. And he said, well, what bothers me is that with all the advances in biotechnology, the high school kids who are now inventing computer viruses will soon be inventing real viruses. Well, that's upsetting. These things can get easily out of hand in the best of conditions. But the idea that with these really fascinating and important new advances in technology, you could cook up a disease. There's an experiment called gain of function, which they were doing at the Wuhan lab, which is why it's under suspicion right now. But you take a virus, a bat virus, for instance, and you see what it would take to make it into a human virus. And the way you do it is pretty easy. You take the virus and you put it in the nose of a ferret. And then when the ferret gets sick, you take the virus out of his nose and put it in another ferret. And then eventually it adapts itself to a ferret, and ferrets are very, very close to humans in terms of their immune system. And there was a scientist in the Netherlands who decided to take this flu, H5N1, which is not an epidemic in humans, but it is in birds. And a poultry farmer in China, when people get sick from their poultry, 60% of them die. It's that fatal. And he thought, well, what would it take to make this a human disease? It only took 3 passes to make it into a human disease. He might as well have invented a hydrogen bomb. But what high school kid in biological sciences can't do that? So yes, that keeps me up, and I'm sorry I've given anybody the idea.
Okay, we're getting close to running out of time. And I don't see any more questions. Do you have any final words for us?
Well, I want to come back to Alpine. When I was working on God Save Texas, my wife and I spent a delightful time there. And West Texas, I hope that you guys get your health care, because really that's all it's lacking in a lot of communities. It's the missing part of the puzzle for economic growth. Who wants to move to a place where they can't be safe? And so, yes, it would make a huge difference. And maybe one day you can get a medical school at Sul Ross, and then your troubles will be over. I wish that for you.
That would be nice. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This has been really terrific.
Well, thank you. I'll pass through the library next time I'm in town.
Okay, great. Do that.
All right. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.